Hi everyone, hope you're well. So this week we are looking at the next section in Luke, and this passage takes us through the journey of Jesus's trial and conviction. Firstly, at the hands of the Jewish leaders, made up of the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and then lastly when Jesus was passed over to Pilate. And Pilate was the one who held the authority in the Roman government over convictions at that time. And we always tend to focus, I think, rightly on the truth of the cross and the fact that Jesus died to make the relationship right between the Father and his children. But in this passage, we're looking at the time leading up to that great sacrifice, something that is not often an area that we focus on. So I'd like to bring out a couple of points that I think can get us thinking about what this means for us today. And it starts in Luke 22 with a focus on Jesus' identity, where he's questioned by the leaders. If you're the Messiah, tell us. And Jesus gives two statements back. Firstly, he says, if I tell you, you won't believe me. And then he says, and if I asked you, you wouldn't answer. So Jesus is aware, even at this early stage in his trial, that the elders are trying to trick him. But he never denies his name nor his authority. He uses the words, that is what you say I am. But why does he do this? With the benefit of hindsight, we can look back and say, why were the Jewish leaders, the leaders of God's people, challenging the Messiah who had actually come to reconcile them with God? They'd have enough warning through the many and varied prophecies predicting Jesus the Messiah. Yet these are the actual people accusing Jesus of blasphemy. Maybe it's because he wasn't the Messiah that these highly educated, ultra-religious leaders wanted. And it certainly wasn't who they expected. Jesus was the king who served others. He was the one who rode on a donkey instead of a war horse. His power was not with a physical sword, but with love that defeats darkness. He left the temple to go and hang out with lepers and give mercy to those who most needed it. And crucially, he connected with those whose society had rejected, essentially, the broken and the lost. So there was probably quite a significant disconnect in their thinking. Maybe they were also worried that Jesus would upset the Romans and make life difficult for them in that society. Or maybe the challenge that Jesus presented to their way of thinking was just too much for them to handle. No one likes being told that we've got it wrong or that we need to change. And this was something that Jesus did not shy away from during the Gospels. So the reality is they just couldn't see the wood for the trees. They couldn't see their Messiah when he was staring them in the face. And in a similar way to when we looked at the older brother in the story of the prodigal son, how often are we too concerned with our version of what's right that we actually miss seeing Jesus in situations? Just as the older brother was so full of bitterness that his brother got the big party on his younger brother's safe return, he missed the point and he didn't understand the fact that his salvation did not depend on his performance, but on the grace of God. And I pray again that we would ask God to challenge us not to rest on our version of salvation, which doesn't exist, but that we only look to him and his version of salvation, the only true version, and that we are awake and alert to his saving grace in our lives. So moving into chapter 23, at this time the Jews had no authority to sentence someone to death. Only the Roman authorities could do that. And in this case, that's represented by Pilate. And so Jesus is led before Pilate with three charges from the Jewish leaders. The first, that he was causing people to act against the Romans, i.e. like a revolutionary. The second, that he told people not to pay taxes. And the third, that he was Christ the King. And the Jews would have been well aware that the reason they actually wanted Jesus dead, like claiming to be the Messiah, wouldn't matter to the Romans. The Romans only cared about things that would negatively affect their empire. So the Jewish leaders basically had to make up these first two charges to give their case some amount of credibility before the Romans. So what do we know about Pilate then? Well, it's well documented in Jewish and secular history that Pilate was actually quite a nasty guy. He'd been known for being ruthless, cruel, insensitive to the moral feelings of others. Philo, the ancient Jewish scholar, described Pilate as this: his corruption, his acts of insolence, his rapine, his habit of insulting people, his cruelty, his continual murders of people untried and uncondemned, and his never-ending, gratuitous and most grievous inhumanity. It's not exactly a glowing review. So, but the thing about Pilate is he knew his laws, and we see how he saw right through the Jewish leaders' lies. So Pilate asks Jesus, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And you get the feeling that this is probably sarcastic, since Jesus wouldn't have exactly been looking regal at this point, having been tired, stressed, having already been whipped and beaten before this point. And then in verse 4, Pilate couldn't find fault. He knew Jesus was no danger to the Roman emperor or empire. Even at this early stage, pressure was starting to build both from the Jewish leaders and the small but increasingly aggressive crowd. An uprising of the people was certainly something to be avoided by Pilate. So in an attempt to avoid a difficult situation, Pilate sends Jesus off to Herod to make the judgment for him. And he had to use a bit of a loophole in the law for this, but he certainly hoped it would get him out of a difficult situation. But what we see is actually a similar situation and a similar reaction when Jesus is put for trial before Herod. In fact, Herod is actually quite excited to meet Jesus, having heard of the many and great wonders that Jesus had been doing during his ministry in the preceding months and years. But when Jesus arrived there and didn't perform miracles for him, Herod and his men of war basically started mocking him. And that was a clear sign that for Herod too, the charges against Jesus are not taken seriously. I think we see a different side to Jesus' character here than in the majority of the Gospels. Here we see Jesus in a position where he doesn't choose to act with the authority that he clearly has. And I find that it helps to remind myself of the magnitude of Jesus here. You know, this is Jesus who flung the stars into space, who stilled the storm with a few words, who made the blueprint for the very people who were mocking him. Yet we see a trait that shows a superhuman level of restraint. Maybe it was refined during his time being tempted in the desert, but with a word he could have removed himself from that situation. Yet he endured this for you and for me. He endured the shame and the mocking for us, all for the sake of love and relationship with his children. We hear a lot about turning the other cheek, and I think this is one of the finest examples of humility that Jesus demonstrates here. But back to the story, through this exchange between Herod and Pilate, they actually ended up becoming friends, where before they didn't have a good relationship. It's sometimes said that nothing brings a team together like a common enemy. When Jesus returns to Pilate then, we see a continual building of tension in this crowd, and Pilate's still under pressure. And he says to the crowd, "Having examined him, Jesus, in your presence, I found no fault with this man. Indeed, nothing worthy of death has been done by him." So Pilate clearly thought that Jesus wasn't guilty of any crime. And this was from a careful result from someone that knew the law well and knew the evidence that had been brought against him. But instead he says, "I will therefore chastise him and released him." And to be clear, Pilate, he's not saying this is a light punishment for Jesus. And actually this Roman custom was of a really severe whipping was absolutely brutal. Without going into too much detail, there was a horrible whip, lots of sharp bits, completely could destroy someone. And actually, it was not unusual for a criminal to die from this, even before crucifixion. But even this was rejected by the crowd. At this point, some translations talk about a part of the law that made it possible to release a single prisoner to the people at Passover. But whatever the case, Pilate tries this one more time to release Jesus. But instead, the crowd are crying out for the release of Barabbas, a known murderer and terrorist. So ironically, if ever there was a man who would rightly be accused of crimes against Rome, this was him. But looking over the course of these exchanges and the building volume from the crowd, 3 times Pilate tries to free Jesus. In verse 4, he says, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." In verse 14, he says, "I have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us, as you can see. He has done nothing to deserve death." And then in verse 22, again being questioned by the crowd, "Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty." But finally, he gives in. And up until this, for 3 times, the ruthless, cruel Pilate is the one speaking up for Jesus. Now, I'm by no means intending to paint Pilate as a good man. We've heard before about his character, and he certainly wasn't a God-fearing man. But I think that's the significance. It was the one who wasn't expecting a Messiah, the one who wasn't part of God's chosen people, who had the last attempt to stop the greatest injustice the world has ever seen. And it got me thinking about my role in the story. What do I take away from this? What do we take away from this? And one challenge I've felt is about the times where I should be the person shouting for justice. Yet instead, am I more like the Jews screaming for their version of justice? Am I more interested in my own agenda than for standing up for Jesus in that situation? In Matthew 25, it says, "The king will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.' Essentially, treat everyone you come across with the same kindness, dignity, and love as if you were doing it directly for me." Do I leave it to someone else, perhaps someone that doesn't know God, to be the person who shows kindness, who shows mercy to someone who needs it? Of course, there are many, many good people in the world who are not followers of Jesus, but we're called to be the first to help people and the first to stand up for injustice when we see it. Thanks so much for listening. Looking forward to seeing you on Sunday when we can go through this passage in a bit more detail.